Evening and welcome. My special guest tonight describes himself quite simply as a reporter, which is a bit like Frank Sinatra calling himself a pop singer or Menuhin a fiddle player. Ernest Hemingway once described him as the greatest reporter. Another critic said he was the first broadcaster of the world. He's written millions of words about people and events, made exceedingly popular television shows, but is best known for a weekly spot on radio, which started in 1946 and is still going strong. It's called Letter from America, and if there be a special relationship between us and the Americans, it is in part due to the author of those letters, and my special guest tonight, Mr. Alistair Cooke. The only confusion there seems to be in reading about your life story was in fact exactly where you were born, Alistair. Would you like to clear that up now?
Legitimate.
You're legitimate, I know. That's right. Of course, there's no doubt about that.
Very unfashionable today. But,
that's right.
It's always put Manchester because in books nobody knew a part of Manchester, which in those days was Manchester, which was Salford.
Oh, yes.
Since then, Salfordians, I can't even say it, have said you weren't born in Manchester, you were born in Salford. Now I understand they have a university.
That's
so
right.
I was born in Salford.
You were born in Salford?
Yes, I was.
Of course, I mean, the two cities in fact merge and are congealed together forevermore. That's right, yes. What about your parents? I mean, what were they?
What were they? They were married. And my father was an art metal designer. And my proudest moment as a boy was, my mother was, I think the best thing you can say about my mother is that she was a very strict Wesleyan, and she had chronic bronchitis. And in the beginning of the First World War, she was told by a doctor who was better at medicine than psychology that the only cure for this was to go to one of two places, Egypt, during the First World War, or Blackpool. On the whole, it seemed more convenient to go to Blackpool. And we went there. And my father then, because the war was on, was drafted into the, I think it was called the Avro, airplane design factory, you know.
Yes.
And he got lost. I mean, he appeared every 2 months on leave. You see, he was something absurdly old. I think he was 39. So he was beyond military service. But it was because of that when the Americans came into the war, you know, Blackpool was 20 miles of sand, and the entire American army, it seemed to me as a boy, came and trained there. And everybody had to take some in, and we took in, I don't know, 4, 5, 6, 7 Americans.
And this was your first meeting with this strange tribe?
I think that really decided my life. I was 7, 8, 6, 7, 8. And little boys of 8 are very impressionable. Mm-hmm. Certainly they were more exotic than Tibetans. They wore, for instance, they didn't wear the right uniforms. They wore Boy Scout hats in those days. And they had these things like bishops. I didn't know that those were the officers. We had, I think, 4 officers and 3 men. And we didn't know the difference. That was an interesting thing to me because of the whole class business in England in those days,
yes.
And still to an extent of voice, that I didn't know till many years later that the idea of an American Secretary of State like Cordell Hull from Tennessee talking anything but Tennessee would be preposterous. The whole thing in America being regional voices, and you know where a man comes from. We also didn't know what they were because of the way they handle a knife and fork, which is another, in a sort of compliment, that everybody seemed to eat the same way. So we had there was a plumber, there was an economist, there was a university professor, there was probably some Bostonian family, but they all seemed alike to us, except they were fascinating and exotic and very pale, terribly pale. And I now realize we must have had more Southerners than anything, because my father, who'd never been to America, explained to me that they were pale because of the skyscrapers, you see, and it kept the sun off their faces. And I took this as gospel, and they were absolutely charming, except when there were the blue jackets, who were the wounded soldiers, wore blue uniforms. And down at Squire's Gate there was a hospital. And one day, on one of the piers, there was a Lancastrian blue jacket, and it turned out to be a Texan who came up to him, and this great, beefy, happy, healthy Texan, who said, "What's all this war about? Why didn't you win it?" and so on. And they're both deadpan humorists. Texans are marvelous, and Lancashire people are marvelous, if you'll excuse the expression.
I will,
but
I'll give you that.
The Lancashire people, as distinct from other northerners I could name. And so the blue jacket simply picked him up by the seat of his pants and threw him in the sea. And every American was confined to barracks or for about a week. That impressed me enormously.
It's strange, isn't it, when you look back on how your career was shaped, that had, well, it just had a profound influence in your life.
But it seems so later, you see.
Yes,
you never
realize
these things until much later.
Yeah. You, of course, went to Cambridge, didn't you?
Yes.
Did you, what kind of eminent contemporaries did you have at that university?
Well, you mean, contemporaries? Well, of course, one of the most interesting things, I think, about college years, because it's a world all its own, and especially in those days it was, is that there are at least 25 young men who are going to be the greatest poet, going to be the greatest. Most of them are absolutely dead and gone. I mean, never heard from again, still alive. You meet them on the street and say, "Buddy, couldn't you spare a dime?" But there was one whom I met the second day. My college was Jesus College, and I may come to tell you why. And we walked on the walk out of the college, a long sort of walled corridor called the Chimney. Walking out, and this little roly-poly man, very black-haired, with a strange accent, came up to me and said, "Do you play chess?" And I said, "Yes, I do. My father taught me to play chess." And I got to the point where you beat him, which happens to all boys. So, of course, I thought he was a great chess player. And so we went to the University Chess Club, and we sat down and arranged the pieces, and the first thing he said was, "Do you play classical or romantic?" I said, "I play chess." And, of course, he beat me in about 5 moves, and his name was Jacob Bernowski.
You shouldn't feel ashamed about that.
Not later, I didn't. At the time, I resented it deeply.
Did anyone try and recruit you as a spy, Alistair, when you were there?
Oh, my God. That takes us back into December, November, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I thought the new year would get rid of that. Well, no, I think Andrew Boyle's book is a marvelous book. There's only one thing, though, about the chronology. As I said, an undergraduate's life is a complete life. But it's 3 years, and it's the whole of life. So somebody who's 2 years older than you is a venerable type. When I was there, all the avant-garde people, all the extremists, were literary. There was no politics whatever.
Brilliant.
See, Bernowski and William Empson, now Sir William Empson, were contemporaries, and they started a magazine called Experiment. Michael Redgrave started a magazine called Venture, not quite so experimental. This was the exciting sort of far-out boys. And it was only when I left that Hitler came to power. And then the whole thing turned,
yes,
you see. But I remember I saw a copy of the Daily Telegraph in November, and I could sense in my bones that it began. It said Cambridge was a nest of spies in the early 30s. I mean, I never heard of a communist, you see, but it ended up, and I sort of could feel it coming, one of those ESP things. It said, however, not all Cambridge undergraduates were communist spies. There were some people who had no Marxian sympathies whatever, like Ian MacLeod, Alistair Cooke, and Enoch Powell. And I thought, who is the fourth man? There must have been a fourth non-Marxian.
What were the earliest ambitions while you were at university?
Well, strangely enough, the first thing that I did, you know what G.K. Chesterton said, the world is divided into 2 types. Those who believe that if a thing is worth doing well, if a thing's worth doing, it's worth doing well. And he said, and then those more fortunate people who believe that if a thing's worth doing, it's worth doing badly. Well, I'm a perfectionist. I'm too vain, I suppose, to do things badly. I want to do them well. First thing I did well was caricaturing.
Oh.
And I earned my first money by doing caricatures of famous authors for the Bodley Head, who happened to be today my present publisher.
We've in fact got a couple of sheets, I think, somewhere on captions. There we are. Can you see them there, Alistair? And they are what your...
In the left-hand corner, as I look, is E.M. Foster. No, he's just gone by it. Well, it's a live show, and you never know. The thing on the left was the Persian exhibition in London, and I did 2 Persian cats. E.M. Foster on the left. If he will move on. I know he's entranced by the likeness there. Then we did, there was John Maynard Keynes, various other people. Now that character, that is Sir Arthur Quiller Cooke, known, totally forgotten today, known as Q.
Q, that's right.
And he was the professor of English literature. And he was a Cornishman, and he was unlike most of the professors. He had a range of life and sympathies outside academica. I mean, he'd been mayor of Foy, he'd fought for education for elementary school, so on and so on. And he was extremely kind to me. And I went to Jesus College because I adored his writings. And he was rather like a 3-week fiddle student going to live with Beethoven. And I lived on his staircase, and he was very kind to me. And I think of him now because I think of all the... there was a caricature there of I.A. Richards, who's just died, who revolutionized English criticism. Q had more effect on my writing than any single person because he was kind enough to say to me, if you have an essay that you especially like, bring it to me. And I never forget the day I went into his rooms at about 6 o'clock. And he was a great dandy. And he was dressing for a dinner. And he dressed downwards, which is interesting. He had no trousers on by the time he was fixing his white tie, you see. And he would patter off. He was also quite a toper. And he'd come in and take his noggin, or snort, whiskey, go off into the bedroom, put on his braces. Meanwhile, he had my essay on, I think it was Swinburne. And I gave this to him because I knew on the 4th page was the greatest piece of writing ever done by an undergraduate. And I was waiting for the 4th page, you see. And so he came in and he was fixing his tie. He looked at the first page and grunted, turned it over, and then he went off, put on his shirt, and then he came back, and there he stood in what we used to call suspenders, then, those days, and completely dressed except no trousers, came to the 4th page, and he read it, and he said, Cooke, you must learn to murder your darlings. And then he tottered off and put his trousers on. And it was the first hint that young men especially tend to overwrite. Right. If somebody says, write better, you put in more adjectives. And it was years later that I had the ambition, which I still have, to be as simple and lucid, so whether people agree with you or not, they know exactly what you mean.
Right. Yes, I mean, that's the essence of the good.
To me, of good writing.
Of good writing.
It's easier, that it looks easier than it is,
Yes. People should imagine that when they read a piece by you or hear you on the radio, it's just been sort of tossed off the cuff.
That's been as a matter of fact, I do write fast, but that's been the thing I love doing most at the radio, is writing for talking.
Yes.
And making it, the greatest compliment anybody's ever paid is to say, how can you do it for 13 and a half minutes, not knowing what to say, thinking there's no script.
Little do they know. Well, let's talk about the radio, because, I mean, you first of all, your first radio job, I think I'm right in saying, was as a film critic, was it not?
BBC film critic.
BBC film critic. How did that come about?
I was on a fellowship. I left Cambridge and went directly to Yale. I was lucky enough to get something called a Commonwealth Fellowship, which was American money.
Right.
And it was a 2-year fellowship. And I did a year at Yale and a year at Harvard. And I was what is now known as a foundation bum. In other words, you don't earn a living.
Right.
And some people go on for years. But I now had to earn a living. I was, in those days, totally non-political. I'd gone to the Yale School of Drama, and I was going to be a great director. And I was walking up a street in Boston one day, and I saw a newspaper, which I never bought, Boston Globe. And there was a big headline, said, BBC fires PM's son. The Prime Minister was then Baldwin. His son was Oliver Baldwin. And he was the film critic of the BBC. And it said, the last sentence said, so now the BBC is looking for a new film critic. And I thought, ha, that's for me. I went next door, called the fund in New York, said, if I could get sort of on the short list or whatever, would you send me over? No planes, only Lindbergh flew the Atlantic in those days. So they said, yes. They were a very wealthy corporation, depth of the Depression. And they sent me over. And, BBC, I must say this, especially over BBC. I sent a cable to the director of talks. I thought there must be such a character. And I said, Commonwealth Fund so-and-so will send, if I may be considered applicant for this post. I got back a cable saying, there are 250 applicants for this post. However, without obligation on our part, if you can. They came over, got into the BBC. They said, well, you're late, and we wanted you to do a little specimen talk. And I said, give me a typewriter. And they were very languid in those days. They said, you mean now? I said, now. And I'll do something on the last film I saw, which was a thing called Blonde Bombshell. So I sat down, banged it out, and it was 5-6 minutes. Piped into the director of talks. There was such a man. And he, all smiles, he said, you've got the job. That's how I started.
And, of course, that was the start of a long and abiding passion with the film industry, wasn't it?
It was, but what I didn't know at the time was it was to be an even longer and more abiding passion with radio. You see, my first talk was done on October the 5th, 1934. You realize I was a child prodigy because clearly...
You were very young.
Clearly, 45 years ago is preposterous. I was 8 at the time.
Yeah. But what about the stars that you got to know intimately later on? Did you have, like I have, I must admit, when I meet them, a kind of hero worship feeling about them?
Oh, well, you see, I think I was sort of inoculated against lesser fame by a complete freak. Knowing Chaplin.
Yes.
The first time I went to Hollywood, I wrote to the Observer, said, could I do a series on Hollywood? And luckily their film critic was going to be off, and they said yes. So I wrote to Lubitsch and Chaplin, and Chaplin replied. I mention that because it must be the only letter he ever wrote. And he saw me, and I spent the summer with him. And after Chaplin, meeting Slim Somerville or Laura Hardy was nothing.
Or Gail Thundergaard, even.
But later, later, of course, I got to know some, and one that I think became a charming relationship. Years later, when I did the first American television show, 90-minute show, the producer said to me one day, got a great idea. I can get James Mason and Pamela Mason to read the letters of Josephine and Napoleon. He'd read the Josephine, and so on. Just a little feature of 15 minutes. A show called Omnibus. You snaffle the title, but a totally different show. I said, James Mason? How? I'd love to meet James Mason. And I should say that in those days, all television was live. Movie actors were scared stiff because instead of memorizing 30 seconds, you had to memorize 20 minutes. So we got every great American actor. Came from Hollywood, and the producer said to me before I met him, he's very amused about the last time you met. I said, I've never met James Mason. He said, oh yes, you have. You gave him an audition. Then I remembered, I founded something called the Cambridge University Mummers. In fact, exactly 50 years ago. I used to run auditions, you see. One day, a little man, my wife, who's a portrait painter, points out he's not a little man, he has a big head. And people with big heads look little. He's actually 6 feet. Came across this common on a bitter cold day for an audition for me. And he sat there and we did Journey's End. And he did it. And he wasn't very good. And I said, the great president of the society, you see, I said, what are you studying? And he said, architecture. I said, stay with it. 20 years later, I discovered he was James Mason. The only other man I turned down who was absolutely hopeless, we never heard from us again, was the man who turned into Sir John Clements. So I would have been a great director.
Let's continue this thing then about your broadcasting, your radio work, because you started the Letter from America in 1946.
For 13 weeks.
For 13 weeks.
Well, you see, they had no money, no dollar exchange.
Yes.
And Lindsay Wellington, who was a great friend of mine, then head of radio, which they call sound radio. I couldn't quite understand that. I don't know what other kind there is. He said, look, if this is a great success, we'll put it on for another 13 weeks, but we have only the money, 26 weeks. So then they forgot.
And that's all that time ago.
It was 34 years.
You're now in the Guinness Book of Records, the longest considered running radio show.
Don't say that, because the BBC may hear.
You've also, of course, you're still sending over the tapes in the same way, aren't you? You actually post your tapes from...
When, you see, in the early... Of course, they were live in the early days. And then they used to be sent over on these great 16-inch discs, which was very clumsy. When taping came in, they asked me if I wanted to do a live, and I said no, because as far as I'm concerned, my whole idea of radio, and for that matter television, is talking to one person in a room, not to the Albert Hall. It's intimate. And you lose a lot in taking a circuit, and the music circuit costs a great deal of money, which is the nearest thing. So they agreed that we would tape them ahead of time. Led to trouble in time, but so we do. We tape them. I do them on Wednesday, and they're flown over Thursday, and they're examined carefully by customs for contraband. And then they're played, as you know, Friday night, Sunday morning, and then they go around the world. And that's the problem. Sometimes there's a week interval.
Which must mean the deadline, or the updating is...
I've had excruciating experience.
Like what?
The worst was during the great Nixon, the days before the abdication.
Yes.
Things seemed to be coming to a head, and now all the historians will say, of course, it was inevitable. But I was in San Francisco, just taken a bet with a friend of mine that Nixon would not abdicate. He'd brazen it out. I did that talk on Sunday, because being in San Francisco, I had to go to New York, then to London. And I got up to the point of knowing that Senator Goldwater, Rhodes, the minority leader, and two other very conservative Republicans were the people chosen to go to him and say, you have to go. But they hadn't decided, and Nixon had no intention of resigning yet. We heard rumors and this and that. People bet, yes, he'll go, no, he won't. So I went right up to the moment, and the talk is in the new book, where it ends, and the time had come when these, not the liberals, not the press, but his own right-wing buddies would have to go to him and maybe say to him, you have to go. And then I thought, now what do I say? Suppose he does. So I put, and the rest, you know. So by the time it came out, he'd gone.
And the rest they knew.
And the rest they knew. But
right.
That was the scariest sentence I ever wrote.
Yeah. The book that you mentioned there, of course, is called The Americans, and it's a compilation, a choice of, 50
talks from the decade of the 70s.
Yes.
It is available at all bookstores right now.
Yeah. People also, of course, tend to forget in this country, because you haven't done as much here as you did in America, that, of course, you were in the very early days of television.
Oh, totally unknown. Americans have to say, what's this about radio?
Yes, it's in America you're known as a television person.
An English friend said to an American, what is all this talk in America about Cooke and upstairs, downstairs? Well, of course, I do these introductions to something called Masterpiece Theatre, and we get best of BBC and the best of the other networks.
Right.
The other network. And, of course, I'm totally television there, so,
yes.
I have your trouble of total recognition there, whereas here, if I keep my trap shut, which you realize is quite difficult, but I go in a chemist shop and people recognize me, but don't recognize my face.
Yes. Well, let's have a look then at the very young Alistair Cooke, actually, on the very young days of television. We've got a clip here from a television program called Speaking Personally, which, in fact, you are doing what you say you're doing, just talking to the camera as if it were a person. This is 52.
Good evening. Oh, I'd better not advertise the brand. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very privileged to be allowed to look you in the eye for once. And I've been introduced as appearing in the flesh. I think you will see that it would be more appropriate to say that I was appearing this evening in the bone, with a little coating of flesh. Now, I have a mild terror of appearing before you this evening and looking at you for once, because I believe that just as a writer who pleases you, should remain anonymous behind the printed page, so I think a broadcaster should be heard and not seen, because all your illusions are shattered when you see the man in the bone and the flesh. I met a man last week who looked at me and came over with a sort of pale biscuit complexion and said, "But you can't possibly be Alistair Cooke." He said, "You're a fat, jolly man." Well, of course, there's nothing I can do about that at this time of day. I hope I'm jolly enough when the occasion demands, but the other thing I can only do is pillows.
Let's talk about Alistair Cooke, journalist at large now. You're one of those extraordinarily rare journalists, I suppose. You become as famous as the people that you've interviewed. But looking at and reading looking at your work and reading you as I've done for many, many years now, you've covered an extraordinary range of people in your writings and your broadcasts. Can we talk about some of the most interesting people that you found in your life? I mean, first of all, what about the really interesting characters that you met?
Like who? Like Sigmund Freud, you mean?
Well,
Jack Nicklaus?
Like anybody who you think...
Well, in America?
Yes.
Well, you know, I mean, I won't go on. People who read at all, or read my books, know that H.L. Mencken was the most remarkable man in my profession.
Yes.
But it's curious, I was in Washington about 6 weeks ago, and I spent an evening with a great friend who used to see every night Alice Roosevelt Longworth, who was the daughter of President Theodore Roosevelt, was married in the White House at the age of 19, was the girl for whom the song Alice Blue Gown was written, you see. And she was always a rebellious, independent girl. She smoked cigars at the age of 19, which she's now 96. But 70 years ago was something. And somebody once said to President Theodore Roosevelt, "Look, is there nothing you can do to govern Alice?" And he said, "I can govern the United States or I can govern Alice, but I can't do both." And I later had the great pleasure of knowing her fairly well and seeing her when I was in Washington. And she was an outrageous lady. I mean, a marvelous wit. And she really destroyed Governor Dewey when he ran for the presidency. He had black hair, very bright sort of movie-type teeth, and a little black moustache. And somebody asked if she was going to vote for him. She said, "It's not possible to vote for the man on the wedding cake." And I think it killed him off. But I think of her when I first went to see her. She had a sort of salon, and she knew everybody, obviously, having been the president's daughter and being now in her 80s. She sat in the corner of a sofa, and she had a little cushion, which in needlework said, if you can think only of something ill to say of anybody, come and sit by me."
Great.
And the last time I saw her was a rather delicate time. She'd been ill. In fact, she had, at the age of 88, a double mastectomy. So the next time, you know, that's a rather delicate thing to talk about. And I said to her, "Mrs. L, I've heard about your troubles, and I do hope that all is well." And she said, "Not only is all well, but I've acquired a new distinction." And I said, "What is that?" She said, "I'm the only topless octogenarian in Washington."
Marvelous.
Great
Incredible. Because you love wits, don't you?
I do. I love funny people, and I think I love humorists more than wits.
Yes.
Now, that sounds a little coy. Let me say what I mean. I think Noel Coward's marvelous, but he was a wit, and the wit has a target, and usually you, or somebody on the outside, but a humorist, he's the target.
Yes.
And I've known, say, 2 or 3 in my life that were beloved people because it's all about themselves. They're the idiots, you know. I mean,
Who would they be?
well, for instance, Thurber and Nunnally Johnson, who died 2 years ago. Nunnally Johnson, I should explain, was a southerner from Georgia, always had his Georgia accent. It was called Robert Benchley with the Georgia accent, which was very good. And he wrote more screenplay, most successful screenwriter in history. And I knew him very well, and he was gentle. His whole performance was that of a sort of bewildered mouse in a world of tigers and jaguars, you see. And I remember when I just finished the television series America, and then the book came out, and I went to stay with him in Hollywood, and he came pattering to the door. He was rather ill at that time. And he said, "How's the book doing?" And I said, "Well, I think it's sold 500,000 so far." He said, "Well, you know, in this town, you're known as the thinking man's Jacqueline Suzanne." But he had marvelous remarks. I remember his an odd name, you know, Nunnally. So it was a family name. Lived in London for about 6 years. Came to me. Suddenly, I picked up the telephone in New York, and I knew he was there. And I said, "Nunnally," and he said, "Nunnally who?" You know? And one time, I was with him and his wife, who played in the Grapes of Wrath, which he wrote. Doris, tiny woman. He was very tall. And we were in Copenhagen, where there's a great furrier, and it was an anniversary, and she wanted a fur coat. And he said, I never shop with women. I said, "I like shopping with women." So I went to buy. He said, "When you need the treasurer, send for me." So about an hour later, she'd picked her coat. I went off to see him, and he was coming from the hotel looking, terribly melancholy looking man, like many humans, long face. And I said, "What have you been doing?" He said, "You know, son," he said, "if you sit on the terrace of the Hotel d'Angleterre in Copenhagen long enough, you won't see a goddamn soul you know." And then we went to pick up the coat, by which time she changed her mind. They produced the whatever it was. Now she wanted a leopard thing. So he said, "Oh my God," and he sat down and lit a cigarette. And I said, rather pompously, but first thing I said, "Nunnally, remember what Othello said." He said, "What did he say?" I said, "He said, 'Ah, that we call these delicate creatures ours, but not their appetites.'" And he said, "Don't look at me." He said, "I'm just a poor white boy from Georgia. Who am I to argue with a black general who quotes Shakespeare?"
Lovely.
And of course, Benchley.
Now, was he the grandfather of Peter Benchley,
yes,
who wrote Jaws?
Earned more money in 1 week than Benchley ever earned in his lifetime.
That's right.
But Robert Benchley was probably the funniest man in his quiet way in life and on the printed page. You know? I mean, and he was the first humorist I ever read who, just to me, was something quite new.
Yes. You've got, in fact, a piece here, haven't you, of Benchley's, which is a particular favourite of yours. It needs setting up, actually.
In that case, I will set it up.
Would you set it up for us, please?
This was written in 1934. Benchley wrote a weekly column, I think for the Hearst papers, which was a humorous column. But at this time, America was absolutely bristling with rumors that Rasputin, you know, the dreadful monk, the villain of the Russian Revolution, that Rasputin had never been killed, that he was alive in Argentina, Peru. They did this with Hitler, remember? He's in Chile. This was about 1947. This was in 1933. The other theory was that the man who was supposed to have killed Rasputin didn't kill Rasputin. And the Sunday papers had endless theories about who killed Rasputin. At which point Robert Benchley, who was a small, bland, moon-faced man with a little sort of mandarin moustache and slit eyes in the most genial manner, wrote this piece. It's called J'accuse. And he says, "Let's have an end of all this shilly-shallying. I killed Rasputin." This thing has dragged on long enough, with even Mike Romanoff claiming he did it. Mike Romanoff was an absolute scoundrel, a fraud from Brooklyn called Harry F. Gergeson. And he pretended to be Prince Michael Romanov, the son of the Tsar, invented this thing, got away with it. Everybody knew he was Harry Gergeson. Founded a restaurant, went to Hollywood, was Prince Michael Romanov, founded a restaurant called Romanov's, and lived it up, and had this incredible resonant voice, and was Mike Romanoff till the day he died. So he'd obviously come to Hollywood. Mike Romanoff claims he did. Well, this is how it happened. We were sitting around in the cellar of the Winter Palace, Rasputin, Mike Romanoff, a Grand Duke whose name I've forgotten, and I. We had a couple of dancing bears in for the occasion, and things were beginning to get a little rowdy, I can tell you. According to a prearranged plan between Mike Romanoff and myself, a tray of hors d'oeuvres was brought in for us to dip in our vodka. Each canapé consisted of a little mound of elk poison, covered with grated egg. And just to make things safer, the egg had been poisoned too. Then he puts in brackets, 4 elk had been killed in the out-of-town trial. So Mike and I were in great good humor. Naturally, the tray was passed first to Rasputin. For if anybody else was served first, he was one mad monk, I can tell you. He took 4 canapés in one hand and 2 in the other and put them in his mouth all at once. I took one and palmed it. And Mike said, "No thanks, there's so much poison to me." Which I thought was a pretty funny crack coming from Mike. By this time, all eyes were on Rasputin. He wiped the crumbs from his beard, took a swig of vodka and said, "Say, those are mighty nice cookies. Where did you get them?" Then he got up, he went to the window and he looked out. "Looks like snow," he said. "By George, it is snow." And he danced up and down in delight to see the little flakes swirling through the air. Those Russians are just like kids when it starts to snow.
That's the sort of condensed thing, isn't it? It's a lovely...
That line. I looked at Mike and he shrugged his shoulders. "Mike," I said, "how about whamming old Rasputin over the head with that iron bell clapper, just to see if he likes butter?" Rasputin turned to see what was up, just as Mike crashed down on him with the heavy clapper we'd taken from the Church of St. Sophia earlier that day. The hair on the mad monk's head went down so far it got into the hair of his beard. But he opened up a little space with his fingers and said, "Come on, cut out the kidding, fellas. I've got work to do, even if you boys haven't." "You try it, Bob," said Mike, trying to dislodge the clapper. So I took out my gun. And holding Rasputin at arm's length, I said, 1 to get ready, 2 to start, 3 to go. I fired 4 times into him and hit him over the head with the gun butt for the payoff. I have never seen a guy so sore in all my life.
Is that specifically American humor, would you say?
I think, well, of course, Mark Twain started it, the business of taking Joan of Arc, and saying it's getting very hot in here, and sort of thing. It's the slangy taking America today and the most natural, simple people, and then making them into historical characters, and Rasputin saying, "Listen, fellas, cut out the kidding." That's practically murdered him.
Yes, it is that marvelous blend of the surrealist and the colloquial, isn't it?
It is, but the best of them don't force it. They're simple at it.
Mm. Let's talk now a little bit about the America series that you did on television. That was a massive work, wasn't it? And
never again. I mean, it did take 2.5 years. Yes.
Yes. Let's have a clip from it now, which points up not only your passion for humour, but for another thing, all American, which is jazz.
Well, this was the very opening program, almost.
Very opening program. Let's look. It's coming up now.
I first heard the blues on a piano. They'd come out of the country, out of work songs, into the town, first onto a piano. In this bar, where there was a little, very old, very raddled, bent-over Negro, just playing the chords of the blues and singing the lyrics that you could hear at nights, drifting out over the lattices of the prostitutes' cribs. For certainly 100 years, New Orleans was a shambles of corruption and the most easygoing town in the United States. At the bottom of the underworld, as usual, were the blacks. And at the top of it were the bordellos run by ferocious madams, the gaudiest of whom was undoubtedly a lady who called herself, after several other tries, Josie Arlington. She had white girls, black girls, and octoroons, and their charms were advertised in a blue book that you could buy for 25 cents. Now, there was one black man, only one, in these houses, and he was the so-called professor, the colored pianist. And at one time, Josie Arlington had the best, Jelly Roll Morton, a man with a mouth like a clapper and diamonds actually inset in his teeth. I went to see him on his deathbed, and he maintained that he'd invented jazz, which of course he hadn't. But he said to me, if you want to play the blues, boy, just chords. And cut out that picture show right hand.
His show closed, I guess, and Josie's house was closed when she got religion. She bought herself a lavish tomb in the grandest cemetery in order to clinch her lease in heaven. She herself posed for this figure, intended not as her likeness, but to symbolize the only known species she never allowed in our house, a virgin.
Were you, it sounds a crazy question, but were you satisfied with the series at the end of it? Because, I mean, it is a massive task to ask somebody to sum up a country as big and diversified as
I know,
America.
but you see, the idea of doing the history, looking back, and trying not to look back at it from today, but say what was important, what were the great issues, and what was going on at the time. And my main interest, of course, was the settling of the country west. Yes, I was. I've seen a couple of episodes. They're playing it on the West Coast now again. But I was, and I would come to people say, well, you're 10 years later, 9 years later. But my conclusion was the same. I said that the race is on. As with all great nations now, America's reached the point where the race is on between its decadence and its vitality. And it has lots of both.
We'll pick us up in a moment. What was in all the years you've reported America, what was the worst period that you reported?
The worst year was 1968. I called it the Black Year, when, there'd been riots everywhere, and then the assassination of Martin Luther King. I was at the funeral, and then the election campaign was just riots, and then I was in the pantry. I happened to be in the pantry when Bobby Kennedy was killed, and then there were the conventions, and on to Chicago, and the police went berserk in Chicago. It was a dreadful time.
What about the 70s? They weren't very pleasant for the Americans either, were they?
Well, that was Vietnam, you see. But a great deal had happened, and there had been great changes, and there had been great progress for the blacks. Maybe not enough, but very considerable compared with what it had been. But once out of Vietnam, I think the country sort of stabilized.
Well, when you talk about the conflict or the fight between the decadence and the vigor of America, what specifically do you mean by that?
Well, I don't think anything particularly American, except sometimes they invent things, good and bad. It's something which, to me, afflicts the entire Western world. I mean, from pornography and less and less pride in work, and that's really what I mean, I think. And the vitality is the thing that strikes me whenever I go back, when I've been here and go back to America, is the fact that it's a stew and it's a ferment, but people are talking about the problems of today. They're not talking about the past,
Which is the difference between here and
It
there.
does strike me. There's a great deal of nostalgia going on about Gladstone, Disraeli, the Prince Regent, and so on, and they don't tend to do that. They tend to do documentaries or dramas about today, or you see.
Why is
Now,
that?
I don't know. This is odd because remember, in 3 years ago, will be coming up 4 years. 1776 was the bicentennial.
Right.
And of course there were tremendous celebrations and things there, and and I remember I think that got us out of Vietnam and was a sort of a proud time and a good time. I mean, because everybody did some sort of celebration of the 200th anniversary of the founding of even the Congress. Had the 200th anniversary of the Continental Congress, at which I was invited to speak, that was I think the most bowling over moment of my life.
What's addressing the American Congress?
Well, it was funny. I was supposed to be addressing the annual dinner of the Royal and Ancient Golf Club, which was an extreme proud moment to me. And a friend of mine, Alan Owen, who is the music producer for my jazz series on radio, he was staying with me, and I got this invitation to address the Congress on the occasion of the 200th anniversary of the First Continental Congress, which was in September 1775. I said, I can't do that. I shall be at St. Andrews. And he said to me, look, you're out of your mind. The Congress of the United States. Who has done it? I said, well, of course, Churchill did it. I think Eden talked there. Well, he said, you'll be the third native-born Englishman. So I sent a letter to the St. Andrews. They didn't like it, but I said, I have a prior engagement.
And so your address became, the third English-born
Apparently.
man
Yes.
to do it. Well, we've got, I think, a clip here of a moment from that historic speech where, in fact, you are addressing Congress in all its pomp and all its glory. Is coming up now.
I understood that there was to be a cozy get-together of some congressmen somewhere, a breakfast perhaps, at which I might be called on to say a few impromptu words. But standing here now, I feel as if I were just coming awake from a nightmare in which I see myself before you unprepared and naked, as one often does in dreams, and looking around this awesome assembly and blurting out, I accept your nomination for the presidency of the United States.
What of the various presidents that you've known? Because how many have you known in your years as a reporter there? How many?
See, Roosevelt, it comes out about 7, I think.
About 7.
From Roosevelt on.
Yes. Who was the most impressive?
Oh, Roosevelt. Now, it may have been. I've often thought about this. People said, what was the best time to be in America? And I said, during the New Deal. It was also the worst time.
Yes.
There were 13 million unemployed.
Depression, yes.
One family in 3 or 4 had nothing coming in. Dreadful time. But he lifted the country up by its bootstraps, the New Deal, and the whole place took fire. We had cowed leaders in Britain, and they knew Hitler was coming up, and they were afraid, and and there was a dreadful feeling in Britain in the 30s. But there suddenly, Roosevelt, he was tremendous. But I've often thought, maybe it wasn't the New Deal, maybe it wasn't America of the 1930s that I found so impressive. It was my own youth.
Yes.
That very often happens, I think.
Of course, you had a first-hand experience of Hitler, did you not, when you were very young?
2 years before, the mummers, the Cambridge, what now is now called mummers, everybody's dropped the definite article, is in cabinet, and you belong to mummers. Well, we took them to Munich, and we put on 3 plays. Julius Caesar, which every German probably knew backwards, Bernard Shaw's Arms and the Man, which they also knew, and for some idiot young reason, we did Young Woodley, which was a...
Young Woodley.
You see, the dead silence from the audience. Young Woodley, I should explain, was an excessively daring, and first play, it was at first banned by the censor. It was about a schoolboy who fell in love with his headmaster's wife, which in 1931 was just outrageous. It was sort of tea and sympathy, except she didn't open her blouse. Really an outrageous porn thing. Well, it was the first thing we did in Munich, and the curtain goes up, and I played the flashman bully type, Vining, you see, and he's sitting there, as the curtain goes up, reading La Vie Parisienne, which was the 1920s equivalent of the Penthouse. I mean, maybe down to the neck. And then he hears a noise at the door, and he goes to the door and he opens it silently, and there's a little boy, one of the schoolboys, that's been listening. And the first line of the play is, he opens the door and he says, "Scrimshanking, you little tick." And around this entire audience, they says, "Was ist ein Scrimshanking?" It was, public school slang. The whole play was that. They didn't know what it was about. They thought it was very profound.
But it was during this time.
But it was that while I was there, a great friend of mine from Cambridge, who was a wonderful musician, his name was Lionel Gruber, and we brought him. He wasn't in the Mamas, but B-stage manager, and he also spoke German. One day we were sitting at in a beer garden, and I kept calling to the waiter, and nothing happened. And I said, "What's the matter with these people? They're supposed to be courteous, hospitable." And he said, "They don't like my face." And I said, "What does that mean?" And it really was a baptism of fire for me politically. He said, "Well, this Hitler has an idea that he will eradicate the Jews if he comes to power." And I thought I'd never heard anything like it, coming from Manchester, or you Leeds, or what is this? And shortly we heard a sort of rustling sound, not quite a cheer, over the trees. I asked the waiter what it was, and he said, "Oh, it's the Thursday afternoon speech at the Brown House." Brown House was Hitler's headquarters. So we went there, and they used to have to close the staff offices and get these malevolent women and pimply men, the staff, to come out and form a little sort of claque, because he didn't get a big crowd. There must have been 40, 50, 60 people there. And the nurse, this impressed me, a nurse, and then a little van. And then he came out and he stood on a box and he made a speech. And it was scary. Not because he was screaming, he didn't scream. He was a marvelous actor. And I've always thought Roosevelt, Lloyd George, Hitler, the most impressive orators I've ever heard. Chaplin got him in The Great Dictator. He'd be silky and nice, and he'd turn around and come back and say, "Demokratie stunk!" His great line was, 5 Minuten zu 12, 5 minutes to 12. And at the end of every paragraph, he would say, "It is 5 minutes to 12. He'd say it one way, and then he'd say it another way. You thought, my God, what's going to happen? The bombs are going to drop. And 3 or 4 women fainted, and the nurse, and hence the van. And apparently at all his rallies, he had a nurse and a sort of ambulance. This was his effect on people. He was absolutely magnetic. And that made me understand a good deal later, when they had far more than one family and 3 with nothing, how he could take over.
Have you ever met that kind of power with a crowd in an American audience, an American president?
Not in Roosevelt, no, in private. I don't think anybody since. Roosevelt really had it. Roosevelt could stir people, but Roosevelt stirred people on radio. He was the first radio president, just his fireside chats. But he could do it. He could do it like nobody else.
What about Kennedy, though? Because he had this immense pop following, did he not?
Well, in the beginning, yes. And of course, there was a great deal of rhetoric about, we will support any friend, oppose any foe, make any sacrifice for the success of liberty. 47 allies, we'd, forego our cars, our food, which of course was a lot of nonsense. When we were taken up on it, we failed. But no, he didn't have it the same way. I mean, all presidential candidates develop it simply because they have 20,000 people in front of them, and they have writers who turn them into demagogues.
It becomes a public relations exercise.
Roosevelt, not as much as Churchill, but Churchill rolled his own, and there was nobody like Churchill.
Rolled his own. What about, on the theme of the presidency of the United States, who do you think might be the next president of the United States?
Want to take bets?
Yeah.
The best thing to do, I'm saying this as Secretary Dulles once said to a room of 200 correspondents, this is strictly inside these 4 walls. Don't tell anybody out there.
No, I won't. I promise.
The way to win money on the American election is to take anybody's bet who tells you who will be the nominee, especially, say, for the Republicans. You see, there are 6 Democrats running. Take all the bets, and then you lose 1. I win every time. You win 5, you see. But I would think Jimmy Carter might be president. I'd be astounded if Kennedy made it.
Would you? Why?
I think his character will keep coming up, and I think his character's against him.
Are the American people that sensitive to that kind of...
Oh, absolutely.
Really?
I mean, the business of cheating at Harvard and the Chappaquiddick will not down, and his problems with, and the reputation of a philanderer and all this. I think this will affect a great many people.
What do you think of Carter as a president?
Well, I think he's better. He's a little worse than he's made out to be. Was recently when the Ayatollah brought the country together, because he was patient and shrewd and careful, and so on. It's impossible to say. There are 6 months to go before the conventions. I really wouldn't take a bet.
Yes. Can we now talk briefly in the last few minutes we've got about another sort of aspect of your journalistic career which fascinates me, because I share your interest in that sport. You have over the years written beautifully about sport. Boxing, I remember several articles you wrote, and of course golf now is your...
Well, you know what, James Reston, the famous American pundit, who was an old friend of mine, but he said, Cooke, the way things are going, he said, I started as a sports writer on the AP desk and turned into a pundit. You started as a pundit, and you're going to wind up as a third-rate golf writer.
But you wouldn't mind that, would you, writing about golf?
No, third-rate.
Not third-rate.
No, I do get enormous pleasure from it, and it's great fun. Having been a journalist, you see, when I moved into that world about 15 years ago, I knew all the great golf writers.
Right.
So I was able to get to know the players.
Yes.
Get to know, and even make a friendship with one or two.
Yes. Which ones have particularly impressed you among the players?
Well, of all of them is Nicholas, both as a man and a player. And of course, they say the greatest that's ever lived, but certainly is in the top 3 up there.
Yes.
And the greatest thing, if we have the moment, that happened to me was in 1978. The British Open was held at St. Andrews. And I saw him the evening before, spent some time with him the evening before it started. Now, he's the only man who'd ever won everything 3 times except the British Open, which he'd won twice, of all the majors. Nobody had ever won them twice. He's won them all 3 times except that. And I said to him, have you any ambitions? And he said, yeah. He's very direct. He never beats around the bush. He said, yes, I'd like to win 1 more British Open, preferably at St. Andrews. He was starting the next day. Well, of course, he won. But Wednesday, Thursday, Friday he was not playing well. He was missing putts. Wasn't out of the running, but he clearly was not going to win the championship. So the last day came, and I got this from his wife. He woke up in the morning, he got out of bed, and he went, I should tell you, he'd brought over 42 relatives as a Christmas present, which was very nice. He said, now, I'll just deposit you because I have to go to work. Took a hotel. Would you like to come for Christmas next? So they all came. And he hired a jet, you see. And he told the pilot on Friday when he wasn't doing too well, he said, we're leaving tomorrow night. That's the night that it ended, you see. We're leaving Saturday night. Saturday morning he got up. He got out of bed. He went to the window and he opened the window, and like the, second act of St. Joan, he said, the wind has changed. And he turned to his wife, he said, Barbara, call the pilot. Tell him we're leaving tomorrow night. And I took this up with him later, and he said, what occurred to me was it might come down to my experience of the course and my experience of what the west wind does to the near side of the greens, makes them fast, against the adrenaline that might be running for some young guy, which was Simon Owen.
Yes. And
that's exactly what happened. But I loved it. The wind has changed. Tell the pilot we're going tomorrow night.
No, extraordinary. And the thing I like about Nicholas, and I share your admiration for him, is that in the rather overblown atmosphere of professional sportsmen nowadays,
and money.
He's the one man who can handle it.
And money, which has deformed tennis, and you know better than I, other sports. He, when Johnny Miller was going to be the new Nicholas and perform the most incredible rise and fall in the history of golf, a sponsor came to them and said, we will, for 18 holes, one day, $1 million, head to head, $1 million to the winner, 500,000 to the loser. Because it never happened to have these. And Nicholas wrote back and said, thank you very much, but I don't think it would be in the best interests of the game.
Yeah.
$1 million
That's
for one round of
That's
golf.
right, yeah.
That is what they call in America class.
That's right, and here too. Alistair, the very last question I want to ask you, as I say, we've got this book out now, which embodies, 50 of your essays, letters from America. You've been here for a heck of a long time. Do you ever think about retiring from that particular job?
Only man I ever knew put on his passport, retired writer, was Michael Arlen, who wrote The Green Hat, because he made a fortune out of it. But no, I think if you retire, you keel over. So I propose to go on as long as Ben Travers, if the good Lord will have me.
Well, I hope so. Alistair Cooke, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Michael, thank you.
That's it then. My next show is next Wednesday. Join us then from Alistair Cooke and myself. In the meantime, a very good night. Good night.
I may have been asleep at the switches lately, but I read the other day, and for the first time, the remark of a distinguished scientist, as I understand it, a medical expert attached to the space program. He said that not only is human or superhuman life possible on some still unvisited planet, but almost certain. A race, a breed, he said, as I recall, that could be behind us genetically, intellectually, but the chances are that they would be far ahead of us, both in genetic and intellectual development. I wish Robert Benchley were alive to go into this. 40 more years ago, he did some powerful speculation, not on the kind of developed people who may be living and sneering there in outer space, but on the development of our own species. If you don't recall this important scientific paper, let me remind you that Benchley had just read an article written by a specialist in Minnesota, an eye specialist, who reported the alarming prediction, and since then I believe it's been confirmed as a fact, that our eyes are growing gradually closer together, so that at some time there will be just one big eye in the middle of our face. The selfish consolation for people now alive who might be beginning to get alarmed was that all this would take some time. Countless ages was the way the eye specialist put it. But as Benchley shrewdly observed, and I quote the text of his famous paper, before the actual change from two eyes to one occurs, and that'll be a morning when a man wakes up and finds himself with only one large eye, there will have to be all that disagreeable period of preliminary narrowing of the bridge of the nose, with the eyes getting closer and closer together. And that might very well come within our day. My eyes are so close together as they are, I bet I win. I bet I'm the first one-eyed man in the world. Well, this morbid thought occurred to me because after reading the statement of the medical spaceman, I dreamt of a being who had conquered time and space sufficiently to be able to see 270 television stations and the front pages of a couple of thousand newspapers at one glance. That should make us content to remain simple, stupid humans for the time being. When I woke up, I wondered what he would think when he saw this week as the first item on evening television everywhere, and as a front page headline on every paper in America, 0.7% rise in index. It sounds like space talk, but it's the figure of increase in the monthly consumer price index, and it's been a cause for rejoicing around the country. because it's a vital figure, by which I mean a figure we live by. This is the first time since August, since Ronald Reagan was nominated in Detroit, that the growth rate of inflation has increased by so little. If this went on, we should have an increase this year of only 9.1% advance on last year. The first time we've not gone into the teens, or what we call double-digit inflation. Well, prices going up by only 9.1% a year may not seem much of a drop from 11, but it compares very favorably with Britain, I think, and sensationally with Israel, now whizzing onwards and upwards at an annual rate of increase of 135%. No wonder a parallel headline in the New York Times the other morning reported the administration's intention of selling Israel 15 more fighter planes on easy terms. Well, maybe the rejoicing is a little premature. While ordinary people, you and I, might get excited about it, the economists were noticeably unimpressed. It comes out that the government department survey, it's the Labor Department that does it, the survey was made too early to take into account the first big economic move that President Reagan made after he'd been in office only a week, namely lifting price controls on petrol and heating oil. That sent the oil prices up at once. And the winter's not over yet. About 2/3 of this continent has to have all the oil heaters going at full blast whenever the temperature dips not below freezing. For most of the winter, in most places, freezing would be cozy. The people in the Midwest and across the plains states and the mountain states and on through New England think of zero or well below zero as genuine winter weather. Now, I mention this seemingly small matter because people who know something about the economy of Britain as well as the United States, and they were swarming all over the White House this weekend to rub minds with their opposite numbers, they've been warning us that Mr. Reagan's lifting of the price controls on petrol and oil might be the equivalent of Mrs. Thatcher's jumping VAT up to 15% shortly after she came in. The result there was a jump in inflation, and today the chief economist of a famous New York bank looked at that 0.7% rise and said, there's no comfort in it. The Reagan people were saying so too, the director of the budget going so far as to warn us that the nation remains in a dangerous double-digit inflation environment. In other words, he was saying to Congress, which is now looking over Mr. Reagan's proposed cuts in the budget, and not liking many of them, don't think this little breather in the inflation rate is any reason to pause in making deep cuts in federal spending. I'd like to quote to you from what I might call a letter from the Caribbean, from a good friend of mine whose interest in the Consumer Price Index is so consuming, that when he went off for a 2 weeks holiday, he took along with him as holiday reading Mr. Carter's 1982 budget. That's right, Mr. Carter's 1982 budget. Before I say why, I ought to tell you that this man is not interested in these things only as a hobby. He has a deep concern to see that this nation stays free. And he said a few years ago that he couldn't recall a country with unstoppable inflation which didn't sooner or later succumb to a dictatorship. Well, in the letter he points out several shivery things. First, as a simple fact we all tend to forget when there's a new administration, the new man is always saddled with the last man's budget. The budget for fiscal 1982 is nothing whipped up by the Reagan transition team. I'll bet 90 Americans in 100 think it is. Presidents start compiling the budget for any given year about 2 years ahead. Mr. Carter, in 1978, 9 figured all the expenses of government that are impossible to change, what they call entitlement items. Then he went over the needs of every department, labor, agriculture, welfare, cities, poverty, crime, and so on, and totted it all up. And for this year, Mr. Carter's best estimate came to 740 billions, little more. If Mr. Reagan has his way, he would reduce this to just under 700 billions. But it's Carter's budget he has to work with. Just to show you the way things have been going and to give some justification to my friend's concern for liberty, let me remind you that Kennedy, only 20 years ago, was the first president to announce a 100 billion budget. In the next 17 years, which included Vietnam, in the next 17 years, the budget went up by $300 billion. And in only 4 years, Carter sent it up by another 300 billions. So we are stuck with about 700 billions spent a year at best. And Mr. Carter estimated that with all due economy, federal spending in 1986 would be $1 billion. And this, as my friend correctly remarks, should scare the pants off the country, for you can imagine the inflation and the social problems that would be generated by such an increase in so short a time. All these runaway figures, I'm sure President Reagan and Mrs. Thatcher have been discussing, and I hope fretting over. For, as I said at length last time, for the first time in history, we have an American president and a British prime minister of the precisely same political color, of identical convictions held with similar passion, and with programs for the economic recovery of their countries which are carbon copies of each other. My friend ends his letter from the sands of the Caribbean with this salutary passage. I quote it because I fear it's just as true of the British and the Israeli and the Swedish publics as of the American public. He says, "I doubt that the public generally understands the cause and effect relationship inherent in our present economic situation. I believe people just object to the effect, high prices. They still seem overwhelmingly committed to higher wages, greater social security benefits, more help to the disadvantaged, to the arts and the humanities, all most desirable and humane objectives, but in amounts far beyond the present productive capacity of the nation. The test is always, is it desirable? Never, can we afford it? Perhaps I'm too pessimistic, but having read in the past 30 years or so the economic history of Germany, France, Austria, Italy, Turkey, not to mention living through the past 25 years of American, British, Brazilian, Argentinian, and Israeli economic history, I regret to say that history supports this pessimism. I would add a point. Combine galloping government spending with his partner galloping inflation. Yoke them to the successive violence in our societies, and it seems to me you have the main threat to self-governing nations. Well, this is no way to leave you when romantics have had their first decent break in years with the announcement of the engagement of the Prince of Wales. Apart from the general well-wishing of Americans, there's an American touch that should delight all lovers of Cinderella stories. A young American woman with a Scottish name had delivered to her publishers a novel about the wooing and winning of Prince Charles. It's due in May. However, in this fanciful version, the prince married a simple Scot, a commoner named Rose. The publisher decided that this was now a ridiculous ending, but the author had anticipated him. She'd had her ear to the ground and had written an alternative ending in which the simple Scottish girl in an act of splendid renunciation, jilt the prince because, and I hope this sentence is the last one in the published novel, because it was Rose who showed Charles the kind of woman he ought to marry. It was a near thing. We're all notoriously forgetful about the weather, except the weather that's plaguing or delighting us at the moment. Ask 100 New Yorkers what is invariably the rainiest month of the year, and 99 of them would not even know there is such a month. The 100th would be a keeper of records in the Weather Bureau, who would tell the rest of us that over the past 50 years, with few exceptions, May is the wet month. I don't know what the record is for maximum sunshine over any extended period, but I don't remember a stretch of 3 weeks like the one we've just gone through since before Christmas, when the sun came up at its appointed time, dazzled us till 5:30 in the evening, and went down like a blood orange without ever having been threatened by a wisp of cloud. Diamond bright days which make people on the streets look good and feel good. I hasten to say that in this country, looking well and feeling well have vanished into the Victorian dictionaries. The sports commentators have seen to that, and sportsmen in their post-game interviews, even such as Tom Watson, the number one golfer of the day, a university graduate in psychology no less, now says without a blush, I drove good, I hit the irons good, I putted good. To say at this late date, I played well, I putted well, would sound almost as prim as rewriting the lyric of that old song of the 1920s and warbling, Isn't She Sweet? What I haven't mentioned is that the diamond bright days were accompanied by icicle cold temperatures. New York at, say, 20 degrees with a Canadian wind whistling in from the northwest can feel like the last days of a polar expedition. But while that's been the prevailing wind, it's been mercifully gentle. The pain for many people, for the old and the poor especially, has come indoors. It's one thing to walk around briskly in 8 or 10 degrees, which has been frequent. It's another to come into a house or a flat which has no heating. A fire in a grate would be about as much help as a lighted match on an iceberg. And partly because landlords are hoarding scarce oil against the worst of the winter, which is yet to come, partly because too many niggardly landlords are saving money, there have been some grievous stories of old people stuffed in their beds with all their clothes on and wishing they were dead. Since Christmas time, the city's Complaint Bureau, a regular institution of the city government, has had nearly 200,000 protesting calls about lack of heat. In spite of a fact which the mayor has boasted about, that New York City has a budget of $7 million for its so-called heat emergency, a far more generous provision than that of any other city in the country. As I talk, gray days have taken over again, and a near heat wave of 30 degrees, only 2 below freezing, which means that snow is on the way, which also means a happy thing at this latitude, since snow signifies warmth indoors and out. We're all wondering and guessing just now what sort of weather Mr. Reagan will have for his inauguration on Tuesday, the famous 20th of January. I remember the first one I ever attended in 1937, when Washington was drenching with rain, and the only face that could be seen emerging above the lily pads of 1,000 umbrellas was that of President Roosevelt. And the only sound rising like a clarion above the stair rods drilling against the umbrellas was the emphatic high tenor of Roosevelt himself, caroling, I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. So help me God. Kennedy hit the coldest January the 20th in the history of Washington, and I have an indelible picture in my mind of him standing there with his hair looking frosty, his nose red, his breath pouring out like an exhaust, while old Robert Frost, the aging New England poet, fumbled with the manuscript of the poem he was reading. The sun stabbed at his failing eyes, the wind slapped at him, the white light from the snow was too much for him, and he finally gave out and tried to recite stumblingly what he could remember, his white hair blowing in sloppy waves against his forehead. This memory is stronger far than anything that Kennedy did or said. And for inquisitive reporters like me, the excitement of anticipation in Reagan's inaugural will not be the number of the Cadillacs, the glitter of the cavalcade, the high-stepping thighs of the drum majorettes, and all the rest of what promises to be a Hollywood production, but some small, unscripted incident, the sort of thing that only an imaginative film director, a Chaplin or a Hitchcock, would zoom in on and make vivid for life at the expense of the grand, the predictable spectacle. I've said nothing so far about the essential preliminaries that have been going on, which every president-elect watches with anxiety. Most of all, the hearings of the appropriate Senate committees held, as the Constitution requires, to listen to the testimony of all the cabinet appointees and decide by a majority vote whether they are or aren't fit to be confirmed in the office the president-elect has nominated them for. I've not done this because I'm going to try and hold to my promise to ignore the rumors and the fears of many Democrats in particular about how an incoming cabinet officer might behave. Let us wait and see how they do. And I'm not unaware of the merciless piece by a Washington columnist declaring it improper, to put it mildly, that Mr. Reagan's appointee as Attorney General, the chief law officer of the nation, saying it was improper for him to attend the 65th birthday party of a man whom the columnist calls a friend of mobsters, and whom the New York Times describes as long an associate of organized crime figures. That man is, as you must know, Frank Sinatra. The columnist, the irrepressible William Safire, and he's no liberal but a stout conservative and a former speechwriter for President Nixon. Mr. Safire went to a party at which the wounded Mr. William French Smith, the Attorney General designate, accused Mr. Safire of firing a cheap shot. A little later on, the unflappable Mr. Safire elbowed up to a man he impishly described as a partygoer who was recently elected President of the United States. I mentioned in sadness that I'd felt it necessary to zap his lawyer in print. Yeah, I know, Mr. Reagan responded. We've heard those things about Frank for years, and we just hope none of them are true. I don't think this shot would have been fired were it not that Mr. Sinatra is going to be prominent in the festivities next Tuesday. What riled Mr. French Smith and made him lose his customary cool was this sentence in Mr. Safire's original column. It was bad enough that Ronald Reagan turned to Mr. Sinatra for fundraising help during the campaign. Bad enough that he attended a Sinatra anniversary party last summer. Bad enough that he selected Sinatra to organize entertainment for the inaugural gala on January the 19th. But the involvement of the designee for Attorney General in the rehabilitation of the reputation of a man obviously proud to be close to notorious hoodlums is the first deliberate affront to propriety of the Reagan administration. Well, certainly this is not to be brushed off with a shrug. Mr. Sinatra is now under investigation by a federal grand jury in New York, but he has not yet been indicted, much less convicted. And nobody has gone on more than I about the mischief inherent in the grand jury system of condemning a man before he's been charged. Let us wait. The other well-publicized and at times crackling preliminary to the confirming by the whole Senate of Mr. Reagan's cabinet was the 5-day ordeal of General Alexander Haig testifying before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to maintain his fitness to become the next Secretary of State. In the very beginning, General Haig made no bones about the relative power of the Secretary of State under two sorts of president. One in which a strong president is himself the main architect of foreign policy, Roosevelt, Kennedy, and has his Secretary of State on hand to carry out his wishes. And the other, a more passive president, nobody wanted to say just now a weak president, Eisenhower, Ford, who leaves the creation of foreign policy to the Secretary, to John Foster Dulles, to Henry Kissinger. General Haig made one thing clear. He expects to be the creator and the performer, the boss. This being so, he gave an enormous preliminary statement, a speech written in the amazing jargon of the Pentagon, a clanking procession of polysyllables that sounded as if it had been written by a German sociologist, sufficiently unfamiliar with English as to fall back on a direct translation from the German. When he was through, he was questioned about his views on nuclear war, a profound change in the nature of conflict, about the Soviets. They are never influenced by Western rhetoric, they are influenced by Western deeds. On the Middle East, relations with China, the defense contributions of the NATO allies, which he said in manpower at least, were far more impressive than those of the United States. He went exhaustively and with rattling verbosity into everything. The Democrats, who are now a minority on the committee, prodded him for days about his relations with Nixon during Watergate, and tried and failed to get 100 hours of taped conversations between Haig and Nixon released. The general's view of the disgraced president was kindly. It was indeed that of Mr. Nixon himself. He had made mistakes, but no mention of high crimes and misdemeanors or the justice of his inevitable impeachment. The general would not judge the character of Mr. Nixon. He left that to God. The big liberal guns have gone from the committee, defeated in the November election. There was no one there to say, General, in your opinion, and according to the book of Genesis, do you think that Adam and Eve did wrong, or did they just make a mistake?